Before we begin, this is just a quick note letting you know that I have just released the first part of my own grimdark fantasy series. The link will be in the description. Check out the story if you are interested. I just finished reading The Real Story by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is the first entry in the Gap Cycle, which is a 5-book science fiction series that apparently expands massively in the next volume. As I implied, this story is much smaller and rather simple. It involves 3 main characters, Angus Thermopylae, Morn Highland, and Nick Sucorso. Most of the focus is on Angus, however, as this nasty and even monstrous man shows up at a bar with Morn at his side. This draws the attention from almost everyone, but especially Nick Sucorso, and theories naturally come along with events seeming to unfold in a particular way. But that is apparently not the real story. What follows is quite literally the real story, outlining the events as they actually occurred. The first thing that stood out to me in this story was the prose. In particular, the perspective that Donaldson used was fascinating and worth mentioning. The beginning of the book opens with what I ended up calling third-person plural. Instead of inhabiting the head of a particular person or describing things from over and above, he described the thoughts of many people in the bar. He communicates the character of this bar by breaking it up into groups. People who are passively observant, and people who are more attuned to the particulars of the situation. And he uses this to communicate the superficial details of Angus and Morn's situation, the one that leads to the fiction that was not the real story. The rest of the story settles mostly in the perspective of Angus as he deals with the other 2 characters. There are some deviations as Donaldson relates the past experiences of both Morn and Nick when they become prominent in the story. In totality, the way Donaldson writes this story is in the third-person omniscient, but there are caveats. This perspective is typically frustrating as the author haphazardly lurches from one mind to the next, and overwhelms the reader with a swarm of information from every head with no real structure. Much of the Stephen King novels I have read suffer from this problem. I don't read him as religiously as others, so his newer stuff might be better, I'm not sure. Either way, the writing I have experienced contrasts with Donaldson. While Donaldson does technically jump to different heads, he does this in a very controlled manner, and he manages to keep the reader grounded. The prose is also a lot of telling rather than showing. The author repeatedly relates certain ideas, like Angus being a coward, and he does it not just by showing it through Angus's behavior, but by explicitly telling the reader. It's certainly not third-person limited. I'm not sure if this is specific to this story, or if the rest of Donaldson's work reflects this. Either way, I think that Donaldson gets away with it. The story is allowed to be as slim as it is, in part because of this, and Donaldson's themes come through much more strongly. There's not much left for interpretation for the themes, certainly. At the very least, I think the scope of my own understanding of writing as a craft has expanded. Once you get deep enough into the craft, the more you understand just how contingent much of the writing advice is. Showing over telling as advice is contingent on a newer audience that does not know how to balance the two and ends up falling far to one side. Later you realize that both are important and that balance is key, depending on how you want your story to feel. Part of the reason Donaldson gets away with the telling is that he doesn't fall into the exposition trap. In fact, there is barely any exposition at all. Donaldson regularly refers to things like sniffers and the like, without explaining much, but the reader can grasp the general idea, especially from the repetition and the confidence in which the information is relayed. The exception is the zone implant, but the reasons for that are pretty obvious given the plot relevance. At the beginning of the book, the reader is introduced to the zone implant. This is a device that can be put in the head of a person to induce compliance. The original idea was to treat epilepsy, preventing the seizures from taking over and knocking out the person in question. But as with most things, other usages started to crop up that were far from the original intent. Some involve more noble causes, like treating gap sickness, which is the insanity associated with being out in space under high stress. Others are less noble, including slavery. Naturally, this book is almost entirely built around this device and an associated theme of control. One character relationship is characterized by the abuse of this device, and Donaldson does not hold back. Even as he portrays this abuse, he also twists this theme of control in interesting ways that turn things on their head. People are often slaves to their own insecurities, which can make them slaves to others, and it makes the reader question the degree to which people even have control over themselves. They might be the one in control on his face, but they are still slaves in their own right. It was precisely this relationship that I immediately saw a connection to, specifically one in the darkness that comes before. I will not spoil either book. What I can say is that there is a similar theme about the complexity of control, though Baker's situation is much more complex in terms of the insecurities and the relationship portrayed. I actually preferred Baker's account, but this does not say much, as this book does a great job covering the idea. It is worth mentioning that the parts of The Gap that I have read so far are much better than The Expanse. I have only read the first Expanse novel, though I am finished with the TV series, or at least caught up. While the grounded approach to the space travel was an interesting angle, as Star Trek and Star Wars have never been appealing in my adult years, The Expanse did not adopt a brutal enough angle to really catch my attention. By the time I hit the 6th season, I was kind of rolling my eyes in frustration. The Expanse simply dipped its toes into possibilities, right? The Gap is everything The Expanse was not. It smothers you with the outright cruelty that can manifest in the void that is space. It explores themes that only unflinching brutality can truly capture. And the characters were also the perfect abrasive and macabre type that I love in grimdark fiction. This might be science fiction, but it can also have its dark elements, and in ways that perfectly fit the genre. Something that I have noticed is that people's mindsets suddenly change when they are confronted with subject matter that makes them uncomfortable. Everyone has the line drawn somewhere. For some people, the line is harm toward children. I can't stop chuckling at one reveal of Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Warning, rejected, sick. Watching a child suffer for money? Gaiman is repulsive. I stopped after a third. It's clearly going to get much, much worse. Gaiman, quote, I will turn you into a child, wreck your family, and make you suffer, unquote. Seriously, what kind of person places an evil, living monster inside the foot of a child and terrorizes him with it? This is sick, 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 sick. Very unpleasant destruction of a young boy's family and parents' marriage. Horror and magical evil and sick ideas. Not for me, at all. Never! What is it about adult authors abusing children? Why does this sell? Just because it's an adult's memories from childhood is a scam. Using children's fear and suffering to make money is especially sick. Please don't recommend any books to me in which children are terrorized or abused, or adults have graphic memories of these as a child. Refund from Amazon. For other people, the line is at a certain kind of assault. For yet another crowd, it is the intersection of that kind of assault and children being the victim. True to the second group, here are a number of reviews that I managed to find on the Goodreads page for the real story in particular. I couldn't get halfway through this. The main character finds a woman, uses an implant to control her, and then repeatedly grapes and abuses her. I am so angry I'm shaking. This is a shitty, horrifying book, and I will never read a fucking book by this author. In fact, fuck this author and fuck any sick bastards who enjoyed this book. Do you like grape? How about more grape? Do you like grape with your grape? Then this book is for you. It is just grape porn. Not in a sexy 50 Shades way. Like, what does that mean? The gross, disgusting way that Donaldson seems to get off on. He actually tries to justify it somewhere down the line in the further books, having the victim blame herself, as if the constant grapes weren't enough. This book and the following one can and should be skipped. By the time you get to book 3, it really only takes a short summary to catch up on the action. Don't waste your time unless you like grape with your grape. Lots of grape and sadism. Wasn't what I was expecting at all. One of the most disgusting books I've ever encountered. If you have a grape fetish, here you go. I found another one for you. It's a no for me. There are some #menwritingwomen lines here. The writing is solid, but no amount of skill in writing will make me want... That cuts off, and you can fill in the blanks. DNF. Barf. DNF. So much grape. I despise Stephen R. Donaldson's writing because he engages his sadistic kinks at our expense. His storytelling is intensely manipulative, and I can smell that sort of cheap trick from a mile away. Anyone who told me that I just had to read this series because it's supposedly so much better than the Thomas Covenant one, which didn't exactly delight me either, I will never, ever listen to you again because our tastes are incompatible. Also, if you think Donaldson's a master storyteller, I have excellent news for you. He isn't. There are thousands of better writers out there, and they manage it without torturing every one of their characters to and beyond the breaking point. The real story is a character study, I suppose, and it is an effective character study. I am now familiar with the psyche of Angus, the grapist fantasy protagonist. I am not happy about it. Thing is, it is possible to write a fictional character who has graped someone into a somewhat sympathetic character that readers can root for. Root for? Is that necessary? Just as it is possible to write a fictional character who has brutally murdered someone into a sympathetic character that readers can root for. That is the power of narrative and the nature of perspective. Nair from The Prince of Nothing and Jorg from The Broken Empire are examples. The real story has none of that, and really, honestly, it feels fucking dirty. It feels gross. The real story feels like a story constructed around a sexual fantasy. A layer of iron plates bolted onto grape erotica frame to disguise it as a more respectable form of fiction. Don't do that. If you want to write icky erotica, just write icky erotica. Don't write this real story. I don't really take these types of objections very seriously. I have some thoughts from a writer's perspective on one hand. Ultimately, I just write what I want, and people can ignore my writing at their own discretion. While I have proximate reasons for why I write what I do, there are no ultimate reasons. We just have to admit that what we write is something that we just do because we want to write it. Nothing profound there. On another hand, there is an obvious shift in how some topics are talked about by readers. From what I can tell, a topic like murder can be touched upon by anyone without outrage. Presumably, I can be as insensitive as I please. I could have characters crack jokes about murder victims and insult them for whatever reason. There is even a whole subgenre of romance that's essentially just love stories with a murder mystery thrown in to make the story more interesting. Imagine that kind of logic applied to, that kind of assault. But because that assault crosses the line for some people, not only are there many people who think it should never be touched upon, but there is also a need to treat the issues with care even if it is allowed to be depicted. Not that this is a bad thing, of course. For some reason, the thinking changes. There must be special justification for why that assault was included at all. The critics often can't think of any justification. But it is worth asking, how do you justify murder in a fictional story? The death of a loved one, especially murder, is a serious issue. And you could argue that it is worse than that kind of assault, given that there is a possibility of life after the horror of that assault. But no one ever demands justification or even sensitivity for murder depictions. What's more, there are a host of people out there that have the sudden compulsion to plop their asses down in armchairs, to speculate about fetishes and promote morally degrading just so stories to explain why the story was written. I just ignore them as the burden of proof is on them to justify their speculation, but it is still interesting to see how people react to the things that make them uncomfortable and how irrational it all is. Here is one line from the book that I know is probably being referenced in one of the above reviews. The hashtag men writing women. Her throat closed. The gaze around her eyes was fading. She began to look sharper, more dangerous. Her nipples were poised on her breasts as if they could do damage. Out of context, this looks rather bad, and it sparked some discussion on one of the Discord servers I'm on, but I am willing to defend it in the context in which it was written. In the story, it is meant to reflect the psychology of one of the characters, showing the insecurity and fear within. It is not so much a description of reality as it is a description of the observer's own distorted mind. The line certainly has the corn feel to it, but I think it works for its purposes. Overall, I enjoyed the book. I will give it an 8 out of 10. The book is very thematic. but it is also very heavily based on characters, from which the themes emerge. I already mentioned the main three characters, Angus Thermopylae, Morn Highland, and Nick Sicorso. Angus is the one who suffers from serious problems with control, and this is reflected in his backstory. While he was growing up in a facility, he was put under protection of a man who was supposed to keep other abusers out of reach. But Angus was fixated on the control his protector had over him, telling him what he could and could not do. So he conspired to destroy his protector, as Angus considered him yet another abuser. And Angus succeeds, but only insofar as he manages to frame and remove his protector from the situation. And Angus suffers even worse when he is repeatedly abused by the people his protector was keeping away. Angus's end kind of reflects this in his own complicated way. In the aftermath of his backstory, he is pathologically fixated on this idea that he's a slave to other people. This is why he dominates and abuses Morn. He fears her, and his destruction ultimately comes because of his pathological desire to remain in control. He can't give up Morn, and then he is reduced to having to ask mercy from Morn herself, and is only alive at the end because of her choice to protect him. Morn is another troubled character, though in her own way. She's a police officer, someone who was inspired to become a cop by her parents, though with some resentment for their absence early in her life. She is an idealist, but in this world she comes to a head with the brick wall of reality. She ends up going mad with gap sickness and kills her own family and crew. Then she is enslaved by Angus, who feels intimidated by her very existence. She is so broken that she sees Nick as a means of escape, and for no other reason. The book implies through Nick's backstory that she has not been saved at all, as Nick is another problem in his own right. Maybe the next story will touch upon that. The story ends with her ostensibly manifesting Stockholm Syndrome and deciding to save Angus from execution. Either that, or she decided to have mercy on him. Or both, choose your interpretation. Nick is the final character, a man who simply sees something that he wants and he takes it. Donaldson straight up tells the reader that he hates women because of his past. He was taken advantage of, and now he likes women only insofar as they serve his interests. Donaldson wanted to undercut the notion that he was a hero, instead calling him a villain who simply victimized Angus. Which is true, even considering Angus's character. Also, Nick Sicorso took the name of another person. This was offhanded, but I imagine will become relevant later on. Overall, I enjoyed the book. I think I will give it an 8 out of 10.